Yeah, Josh. So we really wanted to have you on after we started doing some research on this, this idea, this notion of excited delirium that we've been hearing in the Derek Chauvin trial. So for our viewers and listeners, can you start off by just giving an explanation of exactly what this term is and how it's used by law enforcement?
Sure. So I'll kind of start off by saying excited delirium is not a medical diagnosis. It's not recognized by the American Medical Association. It's not recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, the WHO. It's not in the DSM-5. It's basically this kind of medical legal construct that was developed in the 1980s to kind of explain away deaths in police custody and has evolved into this wastebasket kind of catch-all diagnosis that kind of misappropriates different parts of real medical conditions, packages it all up, and then is kind of used as a convenient out because inevitably this syndrome or so is fatal. It happens in police custody, and it really is a way for both law enforcement to honestly justify police brutality as well as absolve them of accountability.
And Josh, could you go a little bit into the exact origins, the modern day origins?
Yeah. So the term actually was first coined in 1985 by Charles Wetley. He's a forensic pathologist working out of Florida, and he had examined 7 individuals who died. Each of them had cocaine in their system. They all had died within about 1 to 2 hours of interactions with the police with physical restraints. They died of respiratory distress, and 5 of them actually died in police custody. He kind of tried to link this and said potentially this is some type of new syndrome that has come out. This is this excited delirium, and that's when it was first put in the literature. And then he was also in charge of looking through all of the deaths in Miami. And between 1980 and 1990, there were a series of 32 Black women who were killed. Most of them were sex workers. They were found to have cocaine in their system. And this is where Charles Wetley kind of came up with, they all died from this excited delirium and there's a couple of really telling interviews that he says that he thinks cocaine does something to the brain, especially in relation to the sex of these people. And he says this whole syndrome kind of starts with kind of drug intoxication. There's some type of receptors or kind of neurochemistry that's going on that leads to death. Interestingly, for all of these 32 cases, these are actually re-examined afterwards. And it was found that they actually died of asphyxiation, and a serial killer was actually found and caught and actually attributed all of these 32 deaths to a serial killer, whereas he had said this was excited delirium. But that was only until years afterwards. And then, but by then, excited delirium had kind of come into the scene, and this is when the early 90s to the mid 90s, in which, if you look at kind of the statistics as well, whites who died of cocaine use were called cocaine toxicity, whereas blacks who died of cocaine use were called excited delirium. And that's when some of this kind of the syndrome stuff comes in which people started defining it as a syndrome in which you become impervious to pain. You have superhuman strength. You kind of don't comply with police instructions, and kind of all these racist tropes and stereotypes kind of come out, in which of the kind of the scary Black man really those kind of stereotypes go in, and also at this time, this is when there's kind of this industrial kind of play going on as well, in which kind of Taser International, Axon International embraces this diagnosis. It's being shown up on a lot of different medical examiners' reports. And then that's in the 2000s, which the American College of Emergency Physicians wrote a white paper that kind of said they had examined this, and they said potentially it's a diagnosis. And that's when you'll kind of see all literature kind of string back into that area. So it's really a diagnosis that kind of strung out of racist origins in the 80s without really any historical backing or any kind of unique features.
Yeah, it's amazing because it's something that you think you would hear from somebody from like the early 20th century, right? And it really wasn't that long ago. Um, s- so yeah, can you talk about sort of just how head scratching it is that right now a defense witness is using excited delirium in the trial, and actually admitted that she trains active officers in excited delirium when it's not something that's accepted by the medical community.
Yeah, and this is something that's really like when you look at it, almost everyone who's a proponent of excited delirium has some type of conflict. They're either being paid to testify, or they're people who are training in terms of how to react to excited delirium, and there's all this kind of you know external conflict that comes into play. What I'll say is that kind of from that 2009 white paper from the American Academy of Emergency Physicians. Three of the people who wrote that were actually being paid by Taser. Wasn't disclosed at the time, and there's kind of been this whole industry that has kind of come out of this term, and you have to really parallel that to what's happening in the medical community. So in medical school, excited delirium is not taught. It's not in any textbooks. It's not a recognized medical diagnosis. So you have the syndrome that's, or I'll say quote unquote syndrome, that's developed in the 80s, 90s, and then now in the 2000s, in which it's kind of propagating in like law enforcement and the legal community, but it's not in the medical community because it's not a diagnosis that we came up with or support. So you kind of have it kind of coming unrestricted, unrestrained, and there's kind of they're starting publishing data. And if you look at almost all these reports and kind of all these studies about excited delirium, they kind of all cite themselves, and there's this really poor science that's going on, in which someone writes a paper, then they write another paper, cite their old paper, and it just keeps propagating where, oh, now there's a body of literature about this condition, but it's not, and it really falls apart pretty quickly if you take a in-depth analysis at it.
It's just absolutely incredible. I mean, Rashad and I had only just sort of started learning about this the other day when we found your paper, and it's just the more you learn that it's just fictional, and it's being used to justify killings even today. Let me ask you, how prevalent is it being used as a justification for in police brutality cases or just death within police custody?
Yeah. So and that's honestly one of the biggest problems. We don't know the exact numbers. We don't know how widely this is being used. We tried to look back, and there's not much data, but in Florida, over a period of 10 years, about 54 deaths, I believe, were attributed to excited delirium. And I think in Baltimore, Maryland, they said about 10% of deaths in police custody were attributed to excited delirium. But this is where it becomes a big problem for us, because in the medical field, if you have something, you could even look at the kind of vaccine rollout, what's going on. Everything is recorded meticulously. And everything is in numbers. You say these are the adverse reactions. You say this is how many times something happens, and that's how we form up with symptoms, a diagnosis. This is how like medicine is scientifically advanced. Whereas excited delirium, it's who knows how often this is being invoked. It's kind of almost cherry picked in terms of the of when it comes out. And also the kind of the description of it, all of the parts of it are really nondescript and unspecific. So it's really kind of doesn't have any muster in terms of scientific validity. And that's a big problem, which I think one of the hopefully ways to kind of try to fix this is to really someone has to go through and look and try to figure out how many times this is actually being invoked and not only in the U.S., but it's actually a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, and Josh, I'm just wondering, on that note, I mean, have there been attempts by the medical community to go into law enforcement and and try to explain why this shouldn't be used as training, first of all, right? But also to justify police abuses, or if so, have law enforcement been resistant to some of those conversations? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So I'll say this is for a lot of in the medical field, this is again the same as you, the first time that a lot of people are hearing about this. So it's not taught basically anywhere. So now there's a push in terms of it's becoming a lot more publicized. We published these pieces in July. There's a recent article in Stat News kind of also denouncing it, asking for medical organizations to really come out and take a stance on it. But 5-10 years ago, almost no one in the medical community has really heard about this. And that's when it becomes hard. It's because you're arguing with a fictional diagnosis that none of us believe in. So it would be something if, there's two spectrums of the field in medicine. We either talk about it, publish papers, and kind of figure out if this is a real or valid diagnosis. But for a lot of people, it just doesn't exist, and it actually has not been at the forefront, or even people have not even been aware of this. So I'm hoping over the next few months to that major medical organizations, like, besides just saying it doesn't exist, actually come out and denounce this diagnosis.
Now, Josh, we've covered a little bit off of excited delirium topic, but we did a lot of coverage of COVID and how it disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, and the death rate, I think at one point was double or more than the white counterparts. And I came across your blog for, I guess, the neurology blog. And so since we were having you, I just thought it was so powerful to me. And just, I can't imagine, the emotion that went into that. So I was wondering, I just wanted to call awareness to it, to our viewers and listeners, and we'll share a link. And just wonder if you might comment on sort of the critical need for diversity and inclusion to combat, institutionalized biases within the healthcare. And I just want to obviously, give condolences to your brother, who you mentioned in that piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you. And even now, thinking back of it, it's a really traumatizing moment. But it was honestly the catalyst for both me and my family to really be involved in not only medicine, but kind of the diversity and inclusion and equity field. And I think COVID has just really exacerbated the already existing structural inequities in our system for healthcare, and it's kind of it's really shown a light in which Hispanics are hospitalized at 3 times the amount compared to whites. The mortality rate for both Blacks and Hispanics is much higher than for whites. And in terms of kind of when you look at both not only race, but kind of socioeconomic status in terms of poverty, so you kind of see that certain groups of our country are at risk, not just for COVID, but for so many other preventable medical conditions. And without a really strong and robust public health system, then it's going to continue to be perpetuated. And it's something in which I think a lot of us have come very comfortable to saying that, honestly, racism is a public health crisis, and more people die from that each year than other specific diseases, and it's something we need to tackle.